Welcome to Homeschool Conversations with Humility and Doxology, a series of interviews with real-life homeschool moms and dads and other educators. I'm Amy Sloan, a second-generation homeschool mom of 5, and I'm so glad that you've joined us. Be sure to check out the show notes for this episode at humilityanddoxology.com. Today, I'm joined by my friend, Mr. Wes Callihan. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor.
Well, Wes Callihan grew up on a farm in Idaho and graduated in history from the University of Idaho. He's taught for 35 years in private schools, college, and university settings through recorded video lectures published by Roman Roads Media and through his homeschool online classes at Schola Tutorials. Wes and his wife, Danny, have 6 children and 15 grandchildren, with another one on the way, I hear.
That's right.
Well, personally, also, Mr. Callihan was a homeschool teacher in my life back when I was a homeschool high school student. So he will always be Mr. Callihan or Mr. C to me. I took, I think, a modern great books class and a rhetoric class and maybe a couple others from you as well. So it's really a delight to get to share you with my readers this week. Could you tell us a little bit about your family and how you first came to homeschooling?
Yeah, in terms of the family I grew up in, my mother and father were both well-read, well-educated. I have one sister. They always encouraged reading in the family. I grew up in the country most of my life. I always lived on farms, so we had lots of quiet time, lots of busy time too on the farm. But we had lots of opportunities to. Neither my sister and I were involved much with. We're not involved heavily. She probably more so than I, but we weren't involved that much in town activities and school activities and so on. And we did a lot of reading, and my parents encouraged that. I studied history in college. I got married. My wife Danny and I remained in the town where I graduated from college, and the friends that I had made in college and the friends of my church there were all very much interested in improving our minds and the idea of education. And we had thought enough about it. This was in the very early days of homeschooling, and very few people knew much about it in the early 1980s. But my wife ran across some folks who were some of the pioneers. Raymond Moore, I think, was the name, and some other people, very early pioneers. Aren't much on the radar screen now, I think, but we're advocating it. And neither of us wanted to like the idea of putting our children that were just coming on the scene into a public school. And so my wife said, we need to do that. And I said, without having any idea what it was, okay. around the same time, we're talking the mid 80s, and so mid to late 80s, around the same time, the community of friends and the church community I was involved in were becoming interested in it. My pastor was Doug Wilson, and he was kind of in the forefront of some of the early classical Christian education movements. And he was doing the research that would lead to him writing The Lost Tools of Learning and so forth. And we were all in the thick of that and learning for the first time about what education was in the past, because the only exposure any of us had ever had, I'm sure it's different now because homeschooling has been out there. It's on people's radar screen. But at the time, the only experience any of us had with the idea of education was what we knew in the public schools. And so we got into, my wife and I got into homeschooling because of our despair when we looked at the public schools and because of the interest she saw in some of these early books. And we got into, I began to be interested in classical education as it applied to homeschooling, especially as a result of the studies we were all doing, because others in our community also were saying no way to the public schools.
Well, over the years, I mean, so you guys were starting homeschooling back in that same time. I'm so thankful for people like you and my parents and my in-laws who were really pioneers. I think about like homeschooling before the internet, I mean, before you could just go on and get any information you wanted, and really having to figure all this out for the first time. And I'm very thankful. My generation of homeschoolers definitely stands on y'all's shoulders. But how has your idea about Christian classical education kind of grown and developed over the years, just as you've had time to think more and apply more? And
Right. Actually, I don't think that my ideas about classical Christian education um, and homeschooling, I'm thinking of those two things together. I don't think those ideas have changed radically. Um, there's been refinements, and one refinement in particular I'll mention here in just a second. But the idea that things that classical education is focused on development of the whole of the imagination, of the soul, of the mind, of the spirit, and that it's not about getting a job. The utter repudiation of the idea that education is vocational. Education is not vocational. Vocational training is good, but education and vocational training are different things. And the abandonment of education for a pure focus on vocational training in modern education over the last 100 odd years has been the great tragedy of our educational experience in modern America. And so from pretty much the beginning, we realized that was the problem, that education is focused on developing, historically has been focused on developing the human person, the spirit, the soul, the imagination. And that means reading history and literature and studying the languages. This is not to dismiss the importance of other subjects, but at the center of it is the human experience over long stretches of time, especially as it came under the influence of Christianity. When Christianity comes on the scene in the late Roman Empire, they absorb and take over some of the early developments of education in the Greek and Roman worlds, and the Christians absorb it and develop a full-orbed Christian perspective on what education is, and it created what we call, or what C.S. Lewis calls, Old Western culture. This dominant civilization that up until very recent times, made what we call Western civilization. So my ideas have never changed much from the fact that there's classical Christian education ought to be a fairly simple thing. There's a few subjects that are supremely important, and that is focused on what we call the humanities or the liberal arts, especially involving the classical languages and history and literature.
well, let's expand on that a little bit. Why you mentioned the difference between education and vocational training, and that education is really concerned with developing the whole human, not just getting them a job. Although obviously having work is important, but there's sort of different things. They're not setting them in opposition to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Why is it important? How would you explain to someone? I mean, obviously I already agree with you, but why would you say that it's important to teach children the subjects of a liberal arts curriculum? And why do the great books or these ancient languages that you mentioned, why do those things still matter today?
Well, given that you probably don't want me with you all day long, I'll try and keep this brief. But here's some answers. One is that let's call it liberal arts education, because a lot of people might understand that. People who aren't in the circles we move in might understand that better than they would understand classical education. That's a fuzzy name for that. But what's been called the liberal arts or the humanities, for one thing, gives perspective. Just like a map gives us a perspective in terms of our place in relation to other places, the study of history gives us a perspective in terms of our relationship to other times. We know where we are in relation to other things and other people, just like we like to know where we are in terms of our relation to other places. And knowing where we are in space and time is a kind of wisdom. That's what perspective gives, a kind of wisdom. Many of the greatest thinkers in history have said wisdom is the art of judging and ordering rightly all the things in our lives so that we can achieve our final goal. Judging and ordering rightly, but you can't do that unless you have the wisdom of perspective. If all we know is our own place and time, we're really narrow and focused. And that's one of the problems I've said from way back, and you might remember seeing this on my website many, many years ago, that our problem as humans, one of our problems as humans, is that we're born narrow-minded and bigoted and egocentric. Everybody who's ever had little children knows this. They think they're God. And one of the main purposes of education is to teach us that we're not God, that there's a bigger world outside there. And so long as we're trapped in this narrow and remain trapped in this narrow focus, knowing only our place and time, having what people call a provincial attitude. I actually think there's a lot to be said for loving the local, but having a provincial attitude is an attitude that knows nothing of the world beyond you. And if we're stuck in that for the rest of our lives, an attitude that we're born with and we never leave, then we never have the wisdom that comes from knowing that there are other greater, even transcendent things that show me what my actual size, metaphysically speaking, is. So, a perspective and wisdom. Knowing what in our culture, what people have thought true humanity is, and what true humaneness and what real human life is all about. One of my favorite quotes when I talk to people about the value of classical languages was from a guy named Lewis Thomas, who was very active in the medical community in the 50s and 60s and 70s. He wrote a number of famous essays. I think he was head of the American Medical Association or something. But anyway, he talked about how he hated the fact that students would come to him in medical college having studied pre-med in their undergraduate years. He says he thought that was an awful thing. What they should do is study Latin and Greek and read history and literature and poetry. And when they come to medical college, he can teach them what they need to know about medicine, but they need to be human beings. When I go to the doctor, I'm paraphrasing the way he talks, but when I go to the doctor, I want to go to a human being who understands the human condition and not just tissue and procedures, and immunology. I want to know someone who understands something about the flow of the human soul and what people think ideal and good human life is. I want to know that that's true of my doctor. I would like to know that that's true of the guy who designs my house, architects. I'd like to know that that's true of my grocer, of the bridge builders in the world, of ditch diggers and backhoe drivers and university presidents. Everybody, no matter what they do, would benefit and would benefit the rest of us by having the wisdom that comes from knowing human history and human culture and the arts and the sciences that elevated the soul and that teach us what the real goal of life is. If people are out there digging ditches and selling groceries and building houses without and being doctors without any concept of what life is for, the purpose of life, they're selling groceries to people to keep them alive. The doctors are fixing people to keep them alive. The architects are building houses to keep us alive. But what's the purpose of life? If they don't have some concept of that, then we have a really dysfunctional society.
That's so important. So I mentioned to you before we started recording that my husband is a bridge designer. And one of the things that he does as a bridge designer is he actually rehabilitates old bridges. He does lots of different things, but that's one of the things he does. And I love to go, if he's giving a presentation close by, I love to sneak in the back and listen to him. And he did a presentation on one particular bridge rehabilitation project they were doing. It was a historic bridge from like the early 1900s. And instead of just tearing it down and building something new, they were able to keep the arches from the original bridge and actually make the bridge better and more functional now while keeping the beauty of the historic structure, the piece of that local town's culture. It was sort of an important landmark. And the cool thing was it was actually better for the budget and the environment as well. And so when I got to hear him talk, one of the things he said, and I was just like, I love you. I didn't say that in the middle of the presentation, but he was talking about how, beauty and like engineering and being practical are not in opposition to each other. He's obviously very good, very gifted engineer, designer, but he has that wisdom and that perspective that comes from knowing who we are in relationship to God that gives purpose. Like there is value in some of these other things too. So what you were just saying is so important, and it does impact no matter what your vocation ends up being. I mean,
yeah, that's exactly right. It's easy for people to misunderstand what we think the purpose of classical education is. It's easier for us to into thinking that when we try to classically educate, whatever we think that means, there's a broad variety of meanings, but they fall under a certain umbrella. But we're not educating children to become classicists. We're educating them to become humans, to become real human beings the way God made us to be, so that they can do the sorts of things that your husband is doing. I love that story. That's exactly the way it should be going.
Yeah. Well, when you have taught many different classes over the years, obviously, what has been one of your favorite books? And I know that's kind of a terrible question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you have a book that you just especially love teaching to your students? And talk to us about that, or why that is.
That is a terrible question to ask,
Sorry.
but no, it's a good one. Um, uh, I'll mention, I'll just mention a few that I love to teach to give you an idea, but I'll talk about one in particular. I've always loved Homer, and I've been teaching Homer for well over 30 years. It's just a great favorite of mine. I have to be careful that I don't read Homer more than I read the Bible. I love teaching Augustine's City of God because it's such a comprehensive, vast, cosmic view of the world and time. And I love teaching Dante's Divine Comedy for exactly the same reason. But one of the things, because this ties into something that I mentioned earlier and I forgot to get back to, one of the books I really love teaching is Eusebius's History of the Church. He's writing in the very early 300s. It's the first kind of overall church history in existence. And I love reading and teaching that because one of the things that has changed, you asked this question earlier, one of the things that has changed over time in my approach, it's not been a radical reversal, but a growing awareness over the decades until I've come over at least the last decade or more to this utter and absolute conviction that what ought to be at the heart of good education, Christian education, classical education, homeschooling, everything, is a history of the church. Because the history of Christianity is the history of our people, the history of Christ's own body, who over the last 2,000 years has been working to develop what humanity is under God and being made in his image, and what education should be. And if there's anybody that we should listen to in space and time about what education is, it's our forefathers in the faith who've gone before us. We're not in the position of reinventing something, and we all know this. We're in the position of recovering what was once great. But what made it great, and this is just desperately clear, what made education great in Western civilization was Christianity coming along and taking it and redeeming it and building it up and so on. So I think that the study of the Christian church is absolutely central. And for that reason, I like reading Eusebius because he's talking about the early church and what the early Christian thinkers were saying, early Christian shepherds of the flock were doing, and how they were struggling with issues and how they were sorting through the issues of paganism and how much of it to keep and how we use it, how we use it as Christians and so on. And Eusebius and the people he's talking about live in a culture that hadn't radically changed from the time of the Apostle Paul. It's a culture that they understood and lived in a way that we don't. We're radically removed in a way that we can't even begin to understand. We're radically removed from that culture. And part of the job of education is trying to overcome that gulf between us and that culture in which the scripture and the early church lived. We will never overcome it. I'm convinced of that. But we can make strides. So one of the great things about C.S. Lewis talks in his essay on the reading of old books about the value of reading stuff from far in the past, where the fundamental assumptions were very different from ours. And this is more important for Christians than for anybody. We ought to be reading the history of the church, and I think especially the first millennium, what people call the undivided age, before many of the great divisions have separated so many of us. We ought to be reading those people, and so for that reason, I like the fathers of the early church, and especially Eusebius. It's just delightful to see what he says about how the early Christians dealt with attacks from the government, attacks from pagans, attacks from heretics, how they dealt with their own people falling away and being restored, how they dealt with the concepts of the canon of scripture and so on. So many of the questions that are still plaguing us now were answered back then. And the reason we have so much trouble now is because we haven't been paying attention to the fact that some people have already worked through these issues for us. And I think also Eusebius is a delightful storyteller. I mean, he's just a wonderful read.
That is so wonderful. I love that. Church history is so important. In our family, we have actually even picture books, the stories of Polycarp and Athanasius and Irenaeus and so many of these
Excellent. Yeah.
elder brothers in the faith. I actually have a roundup of some of our favorites. I'll put that link in the show notes for people if their children aren't quite ready for Eusebius yet. You don't have to wait until you're in high school to be able to really get connected with our, like you said, this is the story of our people. This is our culture, and these are the people we'll be worshiping with for all eternity. So yeah, I think that's really important. Well, changing gears a little bit, one of the classes I think I mentioned in the introduction, I took a rhetoric class from you. One of my favorite high school classes. We read like the Ad Horennium and Aristotle's On Rhetoric, and so many just fantastic things. But I think that the word rhetoric, or the term rhetoric right now, often has a negative connotation, and I don't think people really understand what we mean by rhetoric when we're talking about it in the classical world. So could you kind of explain a little bit about your perspective on like what is rhetoric, and then why is it important for us as Christians, and how should we as Christians approach the study of rhetoric?
Yeah, when you had mentioned to me before we were talking in an email, this was something that you were thinking about. This question was something you're thinking about. I was reminded of that time when you were in the class and how I taught the class. And here's another area where I think I haven't changed, but I've developed a perspective that I didn't have earlier on. But I think I was groping toward it. To begin with, I think. Everybody understands that rhetoric is about the use of language. It's about communication. Most people would instinctively respond to the question, "What is rhetoric?" with the answer, "It's the art of persuasive communication," or "the art of persuasion," something like that. And that's close to it. Rhetoric is in the great teachers of rhetoric from the Greek and the Roman and then the Christian worlds, where we see this long tradition. The overwhelming consensus is that rhetoric is the art of effective communication, and I think the word effective is better than persuasive, because of course when we communicate, we often are trying to persuade people, but not always. But we are trying to communicate effectively, and so rhetoric is simply the study of the art of effective communication. And so the great teachers like Aristotle in the Greek world. And Cicero and Quintilian in the Roman world teach the principles and the structures that have been developed over time. And what they're doing is what a grammarian does, or a dictionary maker, or a field biologist. They're observing what's out there, and then from what they observe, they see patterns, and they give them names, and they derive principles, and then we can study the principles. So all these great rhetoricians say that the rhetoric is an art. That is, there are people who can naturally communicate effectively with other people without ever having studied it. They just are that way. They've got a natural talent. The rest of us, we're a little bit more cotton-mouthed, and we're a little bit more tongue-tied. And so we watch what they do, and we see patterns, and we name those patterns, and then we derive principles. And we study and apply those principles, and then we too, through study, can become what they are by nature. And this is what any art is, whether it's in music or a sport or whatever. So it's the art of effective communication. But what I think I've been seeing over the years is there's another level to which we can take our understanding of rhetoric. A lot of people would understand if I said everybody needs to communicate effectively, whether you're going to be a member of Toastmasters or in a Congress or be an attorney or not. Everybody should be able to communicate effectively. But I think the argument can be made stronger if you look at it this way. When we think about the things that we need to do and be, we often identify certain behaviors or practices or habits in one small area, which pursued assiduously will help us in every other area. So think about people who, we go to the fitness center, and we go and we work out, 2 or 3 times a week. But we don't go there so we can be better and better at the fitness center. We go there so we can be better in every other area of life where we need our muscles. Right. You carry the groceries, work on the house, whatever, just being overall fit. In Christian life, fasting is one of these things. We practice fasting, and for many people, the season of Lent is wrapping up. We practice fasting because Lent is not primarily a season of sacrifice, it's a season of discipline. If we discipline in one area, we practice saying no to the food that we normally eat, not because the food is bad, but because our bodies tend to govern ourselves, not our spirits. And so we exercise ourselves in one area, so then the rest of our lives, our spirits will be more strong in governing our bodies. If I can say in various seasons, if I can practice having my spirit to say to my body, no food, and my body says, but I want a cheeseburger, and my soul and my spirit says, no, we're not going to have one right now. Then when my body is tempted to do other things, which are not wrong, but are wrong in the wrong places, for example, lust and pride and anger and so on, my spirit is stronger to say no to it. Well, here's where rhetoric comes in. Rhetoric is an art that's very structured. It teaches you to see all the parts that go into making a rhetorical act, whether it's a speech or an essay or a letter, or just trying to persuade your friend to go to a movie with you. So you think of the arguments, you think of their arrangement, where they go, and you think of the proper words to clothe these arguments in, right? So what you're doing is you're judging and weighing and you're ordering. And other arts can do this. I think the study of medicine can do this. I think the study of logic can do this. But the study of rhetoric is particularly useful because it's an art that everybody does. Everybody speaks. And if you can't help with speaking, but if you can't help yourself and you just have to speak, then you might as well do it better. And so here's an art that teaches you to judge and order and arrange so that you can speak more effectively. But even if you never were a public speaker in your life, learning the habit of judging and ordering rightly is, as I said earlier, a kind of wisdom. Because wisdom, as Aristotle said, as Thomas Aquinas said, as Augustine says, is the art of judging and ordering rightly all the affairs of our life so we can achieve our final end. So here's an art in one area. It's like working out at the fitness center. Here's an art in one area that has application in every other area of our lives. If I know how to judge and order rightly in my communication acts, I may be able to judge and order rightly in other areas of my life too, because now I know what judging and ordering rightly looks like and feels like. So in other words, I've been arguing to my rhetoric students for many years now. Rhetoric is an art that it doesn't automatically, but rhetoric is an art that can help us help us to learn wisdom.
I love that. And, I was thinking too, just how wisdom has come up in this conversation, that being the end of education multiple times, and seeing things as like the, going to work out or whatever, and it being for something much bigger. That also kind of frees me up as a mom from the fear of what if I don't get to every single thing my kid is supposed to learn or whatever. Like I can trust the Lord to take the wisdom that he's developing through our particular studies within our own finiteness and the limits, of our family and abilities and time and all that. And the Spirit is going to be faithful to use that wisdom that's grown and cultivated and apply it to things that maybe I don't have time or the knowledge to teach them. And that's going to be okay too.
Yeah, that is exactly right.
Well, what advice or comfort would you have to offer to the homeschool parent who is feeling a little bit insufficient for this task that's set before them? Maybe I was obviously very blessed to have an early classical education, but there are a lot of my peers who they didn't have the same kind of education that they're hoping to pass on to their own children. So how can we go about repairing the ruins of our own education? Where is a good place to start, educating ourselves or re-educating ourselves? And then what encouragement would you have? Like, is it too late? Can they pass it on to their children?
The answer to that is no. It is never too late. It's never too soon either, but certainly never too late. So the first piece of advice I would give is for people to go back and listen to what you just said a moment earlier, that this principle of learning to do something well in one area will have broad application to everything. C.S. Lewis says this, but in our souls we don't believe him. C.S. Lewis says, do a few things and do them well. But we still, but I forgot this, and but they're studying that. Oh my gosh, what about this? The reason he's right is because of the principle that we were talking about just a few minutes ago. If you do these things well here, especially if they're things I mean, you could pick anything, but you want to pick important things. You pick a few important things, do them well, and then the art of doing something well will apply to other things, and the ways that you study these particular things will apply in other areas as well. So people don't have to do everything; they really don't, and that's one of the reasons that homeschool parents get so burdened, because they see and you know what, in a way, over the last 30, 35 years, there have been so many resources developed out there. There's so much out there. So there's so much help now available to homeschool parents, but in a way that becomes even more of a burden because, oh my gosh, maybe this program's better. Oh, maybe I should do that one. You know, which one do I pick and then stick with?
Yeah, it's you can't try to find the perfect curriculum, or like, oh no, maybe this isn't the perfect one. In our family, we always talk about doing a few things, doing them peacefully and doing them simply and doing them consistently is going to be way more effective in the long run than doing a bunch of stuff and being all hassled and stressed out.
Exactly. Yeah. So, so I think the first bit of encouragement or advice would be, and I know you know, so many of us are on board with this, but you can't be said enough. You know, don't stress out about it. Don't worry about it. Don't think that you have to get it all figured out now. It's going to take a long time. And so be patient. You know, be patient with the process. Be patient with yourself. Give yourself slack. You know, give it time. So keep things simple. Be patient. And if people are you know, listening to this, watching this, they already have a resource. You know, is someone they can go to, and then you can offer them advice, and you can point to other people as well, so they have a starting place. They can look at the myriad of resources that are available out there, but not so that it burdens them, but just look and see if something strikes them as being more useful for the particular dynamics and chemistry of their family, and that should be done always in consultation with someone who's further down the road. So again, since this is an interview that involves you, your audience can talk to you and say, you know, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? So for parents who are new, they should talk to somebody who's further down the road. And then more generally, I would say, where's a good place to start in terms of repairing the ruins of their own education? We've all been in the same boat. You know, those of us who were involved early on. You know, I didn't have a classical education. I wasn't homeschooled. I went to a public school. It's not a bad one. It was a small you know, it was a small agricultural community, and back in the 60s and 70s, and even then, when the rest of the public education system was starting to fray around the edges in the rural communities, they were more conservative. So, but it wasn't a great. Looking back at it, it wasn't a great education. And so we all had to begin. The way I began, the way many of the leaders of people who are now recognized as leaders in the classical Christian education movement began, by reading, just reading a lot. Well, what should I read? It doesn't matter. Just start reading. Well, of course, it matters to a certain extent. Read C.S. Lewis, read George MacDonald, read the great authors, read books about classical education, but don't just read those. Read the stuff itself. Talk to anybody. Talk to you, talk to me, talk to anybody, and ask them, can I have a list of the great books? Sure. And we could list off, off the top of our head in an instant, 10 or 20 books that are greats that they can start reading. And then they'll go, oh, I don't know, that's a really weighty one. And then they can talk to us again, and we can recommend, well, this would be an easier one to start with, and so on. But don't stress out about it. Start reading, read about homeschooling, and talk to people about the resources available, but start reading the great stuff yourself, because you'll never be done. I'm still just beginning my education. And part of the reason for that is because we all started so far behind, but also the more I study and the more I read, and I'm reading and studying all the time just for myself. I would be doing it whether I was, a teacher, or I'd spent all my life as a, commercial fisherman. I would still be reading and studying stuff. And the more I read and study stuff, the more I realize how ignorant I am. I used to believe what Socrates said, that real wisdom is knowing how much you don't know. but I'm starting to realize that, that's actually what happens. The more you read and study, the more you realize how foolish and ignorant we all are, and how many mistakes I've made in the past, and new gaps open up. When I was young, I didn't know how. Not only did I not know stuff, but I didn't even know what categories of stuff are out there. The more I read and study, the more I learn that there's huge vistas opening up that I haven't touched, and they can drive you to despair or humility, and maybe a little of both.
Yeah, last week I talked to Dr. George Grant, and we were talking about education as repentance and teaching as repentance, and exactly that thing. There's a reason why I named my site Humility and Doxology, because that is ultimately where a good education is going to drive you to realizing, like you said earlier, we are not God, that He is and we are not. And then that leads us not to despair, but to praise, right? So
exactly, yeah, exactly. And I've heard Dr. Grant talk about that theme, and he's so good. That's such an excellent thing to remember. I mean, daily repentance is a fundamental Christian virtue, or a fundamental Christian act, and everything we do can be used to fuel that, to remind us of our need for humility in the face of a great and glorious God whom we learn more about. So yeah, I don't know that the things I've been saying have actually been all that encouraging. They may have been even more depressing.
No.
You'll never finish. You'll never even get further down the road. You'll feel more ignorant the further you go. But these are good things. These are wonderful.
Yes, well, it's like C.S. Lewis in The Last Battle, farther up and further in. The farther in you go, the bigger and more vast you realize the places all around you.
Exactly.
Well,
exactly.
How are you combating all your ignorance and your further realizing how much you don't know? What are you reading? What are you reading this week?
Well, I'm as always, I'm reading several things. At different times of the day, I'll pick up, and sometimes it happens, it has nothing to do with the time of the day, it's just my whim. But I think that there's a principle of reading, and I might just be advocating this as a sort of self-justification because it's what I do, but I'm going to advocate it anyway. I think people should read. Now, let me preface this. When children are little, we have to teach them to eat stuff they don't naturally want to eat, because we know that later they'll like it, they'll enjoy it. So there's a certain sense in which our tastes and our likes have to be trained. And in fact, Aristotle says this is the fundamental purpose of education, to teach us to love what much must be loved. But having said that, at some point, at the point in life most of us, you and I, and a great many other people have reached, I think our tastes have been trained enough that we can safely say, read what you like, read what attracts you, because most of us have learned to be attracted to the right sort of stuff. We still sometimes have to nudge ourselves along. And so I kind of read the things I like. And so, not sure why I said all that. Anyway, what I'm reading right now, I love to read for personal pleasure and relaxation. I love to read travel writing. So I've been going through both some new and some previously read books, especially in this time of enforced not being able to travel. Reading travel books has been wonderful for me. John Steinbeck, he wrote a book called Travels with Charlie, where he travels around the U.S. and it's quite a good book. I love to read sailing stories, and so I just read a book about a guy's adventures up and down the Inside Passage between Seattle and Alaska. It's wonderful stories. And then on the other side, I'm reading John of Damascus. I like reading the early church fathers, and John of Damascus, who was one of the great church fathers who wrote around in the 700s, around 700 or so, and he wrote he was to the first millennium perhaps what Calvin was to the Reformation. Calvin's Institutes is kind of a summary, it's the magnum opus of the Protestant theology. And so John of Damascus wrote a book called On the Orthodox Faith, which he prefaces with a book about the heretics, and then having dispensed with the heretics, he writes about the true faith. And it's a wonderful summary from the 7th century. A time very different from ours, as I said earlier, It's a wonderful summary of what was understood to be the Christian faith in that day. I've read it a number of times before, and I've been reading it again. And then another church father, Gregory of Nyssa, who is called one of the Cappadocians in the 4th century, who wrote a book on the life of Moses, and he uses it as an allegorical way of talking about everything you can think of. So
Wow.
that's what
Now, is Gregory of Nyssa the one who did a lot of work with worship, the order of worship, or is that a different Gregory?
You might be thinking of somebody else.
Okay.
He didn't write a lot about worship properly conceived. He wrote a book called The Catechetical Discourse about how to teach newborns in the faith. And he talks a little bit about there, but there are other people who spoke much more about the formality of liturgy and so on.
Okay. Mr. Callihan, thank you so much for joining me today and chatting. This was really fun. I felt like I was back in class again. I really appreciate you taking the time. Can you tell folks where they can find you online?
Sure. You can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/WJ Callihan. And my website is scholatutorials.org. It is way behind because of some things I did last year. I updated it, I had it all updated and everything, but it doesn't reflect what I'm currently teaching. But you can go to the About button, and the contact page works perfectly fine. You can contact me through my website, and you can see the kind of things I do teach. It doesn't show my specific schedule this year or what's coming next year, but it will be updated soon. So the contact part works, and you can see the sorts of things I teach, if that's helpful for anyone. So scholatutorials.org, or look for me on Facebook.
Fabulous. And I'll put those links in the show notes for this too.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Well, have a good rest of your day.
Well, Amy, thanks so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.